Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast. I'm Nick Harper, live in Washington DC, and these are the top headlines of the hour. Days after the Texas school massacre where a gunman killed 21, the role of Texas police comes under scrutiny. Cops accused of delay in storming the school while the gunman was inside. Just days after Texas shooting, US gun lobby, the National Rifle Association, is set to hold its 2022 annual event, with former US President Donald Trump as a key speaker, exposing the hypocrisy of leaders politicizing the shooting. Russian troops intensify attacks in the eastern Ukraine's Donbass region as its separatist proxies claim complete control over key battlefield town of Lyman.
A partner of choice. We want to demonstrate to
Australia urges South Pacific nations to shun China's attempts to extend its security reach across the region, seeking to fend off a high-level charm offensive by Beijing. China accuses US Secretary of State Antony Blinken of smearing the country after America's top diplomat delivered a landmark policy speech calling for action to counterbalance Beijing's influence. And North Korea says its COVID-19 outbreak has been brought under control, with state media reporting falling caseloads for a seventh straight day. The National Rifle Association of America is holding its annual meeting in Houston today. Several notable conservatives, Republican leaders and top brass of the GOP are gathering to lobby on gun rights in the country. The event venue is just a 4-hour drive from the Uvalde school, and it's only been 3 days since 19 children were killed by gun violence. Despite criticism, the convention is expected to be big. Major speeches have been lined up to address the gathering, and they're going to reflect on the Uvalde school massacre. The meeting will feature remarks from 8 people, including the former president, Donald Trump, who had a close relationship with the gun lobby and its activists throughout his presidency. This will also be his 5th consecutive speech to the annual meeting. NRA members were also expecting to hear from the Texas governor, Greg Abbott, but he's cancelled his in-person appearance to instead attend a news conference in Uvalde. The Houston police chief says that they are obligated to host the planned National Rifle Association convention, and they've allowed people to protest it peacefully, while the Houston mayor has urged the politicians to just skip it.
We will respect everybody's right to protest and speak their concerns in their voice. We will not tolerate destruction of property, nor will we tolerate people assaulting individuals.
Well, more agonising details and pictures have surfaced from the Texas school shooting, raising serious questions about the Texas police. The investigators have confirmed that the shooter entered the school unobstructed through an apparently unlocked door. The first police officers didn't arrive on the scene until 12 minutes after the crash, his car outside of the school, and they didn't enter the school to pursue the shooter until 4 minutes after that.
According to the information I have, he went in at 11:40. He walks, and I'm going to approximate 20 feet, 30 feet. He makes a right. He walks into the hallway. He makes a right, walks another 20 feet. Turns left into a schoolroom, into a classroom that has doors open in the middle. Officers are there. The initial officers, they receive gunfire. They don't make entry initially because of the gunfire they're receiving. But we have officers calling for additional resources.
Well, for more on this, we can speak to our correspondent Susan Tarani, who's live for us in New York City. Well, those heart-wrenching scenes there of parents urging police to go in, and now much of the focus is on that police response. What do we know so far?
Yeah, Nick, we've been following this story from the very beginning, and we've been getting now conflicting reports and accounts, notably from law enforcement, on what's really happening here in Uvalde, Texas. And today we're going to have another press conference from authorities over there, and they've promised us to give us second by second details. But what we do know is that the gunman was possibly outside of the school for about 12 minutes before he entered the school. The questions now remain as to why law enforcement weren't able to confront the gunman before he entered the school, why even there was a door open, the security situation surrounding the school, and then on the other hand, why he spent so much time inside the school. And then the question arises on why we know so little about the gunman, many days later. But we're expecting a press conference again. But I think the main concern right now is why the story somewhat keeps changing on the details of what's happening. And we can understand that not only for these grieving parents, but also for moving forward for incidents like these to happen, we need to really understand what exactly happened, what the responsibilities were, to figure out what to do in the future.
Coming back now to former President Donald Trump. The State Appeals Court has ruled that he, along with his eldest kids, have to testify in a New York court over a tax fraud case against his organisation. The court ruled that the former president and his children must answer questions under oath in the New York Attorney General's civil investigation into his business practices. Upholding Manhattan Judge Arthur Engoron's February 17th ruling, the court rejected Trump's argument seeking exemption from testifying, citing that his answers could be used in a parallel criminal probe. The Trump Organization is facing a probe over suspected tax-related offences. Trump's second son has already testified in the investigation. That was back in October 2020. But the other three Trumps have been fighting subpoenas for testimony. They could also move to the state's highest court, delaying the matter and Trump's potential testimony indefinitely. In a January court filing, the State Attorney General suspected that misleading financial statements were filed about properties, including the address 400 Wall Street in Manhattan. That's Trump's penthouse apartment in Trump Tower. And also golf courses in New York and in Scotland. The court filing came after James initiated her investigation back in March 2019. Moving on now to the battle for the South Pacific. Beijing is all set to expand its orbit in the region, escalating concerns for the West. This has now led to an Australia versus China fight in Oceania, as foreign ministers of both nations have embarked on a tour of the South Pacific islands to try and woo their leaders. As we mentioned earlier, China is offering to 10 islands in the region the extension of security and economic cooperation. China's leaked draft of the agreement claims to have a lot on offer for these islands. And now Australia's foreign minister has urged the islands to spurn China's attempts to extend its security reach, while calling themselves a better fit for security partnership.
Permanent Secretary for Health. Permanent Secretary for Labor.
We want to work with you on your priorities. We want to work together as part of the Pacific family. Obviously, we've expressed our concerns publicly about the security agreement between Solomon Islands and China. And the reason we have is we think there are, as do other Pacific nations, we think there are consequences. We think that it's important that the security of the region be determined by the region. And historically that has been the case, and we think that's a good thing.
However, the Chinese foreign minister has made it clear that they don't want other countries to interfere in regional pacts with the island nations. Let us now understand the geographical aspect of all of this, involved in the war of creating dominance in the South Pacific. Well, the map on your screens shows the shared ocean region between China and Australia, and the 10 islands that Beijing is planning to approach. These include the Solomon Islands, Kiribati, Samoa, Fiji, Tonga, Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea, the Cook Islands, Niue, and the Federated States of Micronesia. Next up, the US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has provided the most comprehensive statement of the Biden administration's policy on China, calling it a rules-based strategy.
We are not looking for conflict or a new Cold War. To the contrary, we're determined to avoid both.
The US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said Thursday the United States does not want to cut off China from the global economy or try to change its political system. But it does want Beijing to stick to international rules.
We will defend and strengthen the international law, agreements, principles, and institutions that maintain peace and security, protect the rights of individuals and sovereign nations, and make it possible for all countries, including the United States and China, to coexist.
It was a long-awaited speech on the Biden White House's policy towards China, 17 months since Joe Biden was sworn in. In his 45 minutes, Blinken credited the hard work of the Chinese people for the country's historic economic transformation in the last 4 decades. However, he also said that under China's President Xi Jinping, the ruling Chinese Communist Party has become, quote, more repressive at home and more aggressive abroad, and called Beijing the most serious long-term challenge to the world order and global values. He outlined a strategy to compete with China by beefing up ties with U.S. allies and partners.
We cannot rely on Beijing to change its trajectory. So, we will shape the strategic environment around Beijing to advance our vision for an open, inclusive international system.
Biden's administration has drawn criticisms from Republicans for not announcing a formal policy on China, Washington's main strategic rival. In response to Blinken's speech, a spokesman at China's Washington embassy, Liu Pengyu, said, quote, China and the US both stand to gain from cooperation and lose from confrontation.
Moving on now to Italy, protesters have gathered on the streets to demand action over sexual abuses in the Italian Catholic Church. The group was carrying boards with pictures of men and women with blood-stained undergarments. One of the protesters wore a nun's veil on her head as part of her demonstration against the Catholic Church. The group took inspiration from an Estonian protest in April, which demonstrated against alleged violence committed by the Russian forces in Ukraine. The protest was in response to the ongoing discussion on how the investigation should be organised. The Italian bishops are divided on who should conduct the investigations, whether one of the existing anti-abuse committees or by an outside group comprising of academics, lawyers and abuse experts.
Le azioni sono l'immobilità anche della Chiesa, soprattutto quella dello Stato.
We are here because of the immobility of the Church, but especially because the state is not intervening. For some reason, it seems that the state is letting the Church handle the situation. The contradiction of this is that the Church is technically the party under accusation, the party that is supposed to make amends for the clergy's sexual abuse. We need an impartial body, in this case the state, to handle the situation. Instead, the state has been the only major absent party in this whole issue for years now.
Di tutta questa problematica ormai da anni.
There are no official figures on the number of church abuse victims in Italy, but the Primary Victims Association, Rete L'Abuso, estimates 360 cases of priests accused or convicted over the last 15 years. Unofficial data estimates that Italy could have the highest number of paedophile priests in the world. Meanwhile, Spain is celebrating a big win for women. The country's lower house of parliament has passed a bill that qualifies all non-consensual sex as rape. The Guarantee of Sexual Freedom law, popularly known as the Only Yes Means Yes bill, also seeks to broaden the definition of sexual violence and calls for young sex offenders to undergo education programmes on sexual behaviour and equality. The law was passed with 195 votes and 3 abstentions in Spain's lower house. It now needs the nod of the upper house to enter into force.
Hoy es un día muy importante para las mujeres en nuestro país. El solo sí es sí, el hermana yo sí te creo, por fin se convierte en una ley. La libertad sexual va a ser, por fin, un derecho en nuestro país. Y vamos a cambiar la violencia por la libertad y vamos a cambiar el miedo por el deseo. España es, desde hoy, un país más libre y un país más seguro para todas las mujeres.
Combating gender violence has been high on the Spanish government's agenda since 2016, when 5 men who called themselves the Wolf Pack gang-raped a young woman at the Pamplona bull running festival. They were jailed for the lesser crime of sexual abuse in 2018. Mass protests against their sentence attracted international attention. And in the wake of the global Me Too movement, the Supreme Court overturned the ruling in 2019, finding the 5 defendants guilty of rape and increasing their sentences to 15 years. The new law attempts to broaden the definition of sexual violence by including harassment in a public place in its purview. It'll also ban advertising that reinforces gender stereotyping and promotes prostitution. Most importantly, it calls for young sex offenders to undergo education programs on sexual behaviour and equality. Moving on to the Democratic Republic of Congo. On the 17th of May 1997, Marshal Mobutu was overthrown after 32 years of undivided rule in the former Zaire. A quarter of a century later, his luxurious palace in Kwele is a pile of ruins. But in the stronghold of Badalite in the northwest of the Democratic Republic of Congo, the inhabitants think of him with nostalgia.
It's known as the Versailles of the jungle, and it was built by Mobutu Sese Seko to be his personal palace. 25 years after his downfall, all that remains are these ruins in Kwele, in the northwest of the Democratic Republic of Congo. In that time, they have witnessed 2 civil wars.
If the palace is in this state, it's because the crisis is in full swing in the country. If there was no crisis in the country, the late Marshal's house would not be in such a state of disrepair. It is accessible in several places, so thieves come from everywhere, from Wamba, from Ngoloma to loot it.
It's hard now to imagine it in its former glory, when dignitaries from around the world were received here by the former president. For 32 years, he ruled with an iron fist and, according to some estimates, amassed as much as $5 billion in personal wealth while in office. Today, though, little remains that speaks to his stronghold over the town of Badalite, save for this bust in front of the town hall. But in the minds of the locals, his memory still looms large. There's a sense of nostalgia.
I was told that President Mobutu did not allow the use of the telephone, but the country was doing quite well. Our parents were working, money was flowing. It helped to bring us up.
Though Mobutu headed up an authoritarian regime, many here seem to accept his sometimes punishing rule, the price to pay for a strong and united nation.
It was a dictatorship which has its bad sides, but which also has its good sides. It helped us so that the country in its time evolved well, although there was the dictatorship. But now that there is democracy, I think that we have taken a step backwards, because there is no respect for the authorities, for the state.
According to some, the Mobutu dictatorship also provided security against external threats.
President Mobutu defended national unity. We have 9 neighbours. No neighbour has ever dared to take a single part of our territory, as you can see today.
On the 17th of May 1997, Mobutu was overthrown by a rebellion led by Laurent Désiré Kabila. The ousted president died of cancer 4 months later, in Morocco, where he is buried. His first wife and several of his children are buried here in Badalite. Their graves were desecrated. Their remains are now interred in a cemetery nearby.
And that's a wrap for today. I'm Nick Harper in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching and have a great weekend.
This is right, Arab.